Hi, this is Paul Neale from Pen Productions. Today we're going to be exploring a method for building modular sets using splines to create the wall profiles. Then we'll extract them and detail them so that we can then snap them together as sets, either in 3ds Max or export them out to real-time engines. I hope you enjoy the tutorial. So let's get started with a clean scene. I'll just do a file reset. And first we should do some setup to ensure that we can work to the proper scales. First off, from the Customize Unit Setup dialog, we should set the system unit setup to what we're looking for, especially if we're going to be going out to real-time environments. Something like Unreal Engine works in centimeters, and it's best if we're working in centimeters in 3ds Max as well. So I have it set there. Next, we want to set the display unit size to what we want. What's nice here is I could actually still work in US standard foot-inch. Being in Canada and we're stuck beside the US, all of our lumber and all of our building supplies are all in US standard foot-inch. So I'm used to looking at things like the rise and run of stairs in a foot-inch, and I don't understand it in metric. But I'm going to stick with metric so that we can do this all in one unit scale. I'm going to say OK here. The next one we want to take a look at is the grid setup. So I'm going to right click on the snap settings to open that up. Or again, you can shift and right click and choose grid and snap settings to open it up. And we're going to go to the home grid tab. And in this case, I'm going to set my grid spacing to be 10 centimeters. So each grid line is 10 centimeters apart. And I'm going to give myself a major line every 10 lines to be able to look at as well. So under the snaps, I'm going to make sure that I'm snapping to grid points to begin with. This way, again, I can ensure that I'm building things to absolute scale and also in a sort of Lego format. That Lego format is fantastic because Lego blocks always snap together. They're designed to be put together in multiple different configurations, but they always fit together. I'll close out the grid and snap settings, and we'll next we're going to make, with the grid and snap setting closed, the next thing I'm going to drop into the scene right away, and with the grid and snap settings closed, the next thing I often drop into something like, the sort of setting is biped. And the reason being is I have no really known sizes in mind here. I want to build things in a relative scale, and it's often best to look at a human being. So if we go to Create System Biped and drag out a biped, we can then move over to the Motion panel and turn on figure mode, and then open the structure rollout. And here you can find the height in centimeters. Now the height of a person in centimeters is about 170-ish, give or take, maybe 160, whatever it might be. But what this will give us is a quick character just that we can build everything from this to ensure that we're actually working to some sort of relative scale to a human to begin with. Now we can create the path for the wall. One of the things, if you're working in perspective view, you'll notice your grid is very small. I'm going to shift right click, go to grid snap settings, go to my home grid, and there is the perspective view grid extents. I can then turn that up and make it as large as I like so that we can see more of the grid in perspective. Let's close that off. I'll ensure that snap is on with S, and that again we're in 3D snap, and we should probably test those settings and make sure that we're snapping to grid points only so we don't snap to something else by mistake. Now I'm going to create a spline, so control right click line, or of course you could go create shapes line if you like. I'm going to ensure that they stay on corners by setting them both to corner here in the initial type and drag type so I don't make a mess of them because I want corners on everything. And I'm going to consider building my splines in sort of known increments. So my short pieces of wall are going to be 20 centimeters each. What that means, I can go ahead and click, and that's going to become a piece of a wall in this case. Now that I have it, I could also go and make one that's 80. So that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that piece will be 80 long. And now we've got two pieces of wall. But if you notice, they're not the same spline. We could attach them together or work with them individually if you like. I like working with them all at the same, so I'm going to reselect the original, go into the modifier panel this time, and use the create line and create it from there. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and right click to end. And you'll also notice that I have left a gap in between these when I press 1 for the sub-object vertex mode. And I'm doing that on purpose because I want the pieces separated so I can see in between them and make sure they're being capped off correctly. So with that, there is a wall section that's going to be 80 long, one that's going to be 20 long, and then I'll also need a corner section as well. So I'm going to go and create this piece 80 as well by 80. And that should be to there, I believe. And that's going to create a corner section. You can see I've made a mistake. It's not quite 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8. Looks like I've got one too many there. That's no problem because it's easy to move it back. And this is why we want to be working to the snap settings all the time. The next one we want to create is going to be 160 long. So I'm going to take it and just drag it out and then count. And so that one's created. And now what we can do is we can create an inside corner as well. So the inside corner is going to be much smaller though. I'm going to make that only 20 by 20. And you'll see why when we start to align the shape that we're going to sweep along this path. You'll see why I've gone about doing it this way once the final product starts to reveal itself. So that's going to be the beginning of my path. Now, again, just make note that all of the vertices are set to corner to start with. It's the best option to get going. And again, you're going to see why once we start rounding out corners, it produces a better result than we start with corners. We're also going to get evenly spaced segments if everything's set to corners. So I'm just going to move biped out of the way. So 1 on the keyboard to get out of sub-object there. And I'm just going to move the biped out of the way. So snap off. And I'm going to go to the front viewport now, and we can build the front profile. So this one I'm going to start again with snap on, and I'm going to start with a rectangle so that we can check it easier. And this is another way you could have done the walls is with a rectangle or something that you can type in known unit scales. This is going to be a pretty tall wall, so we're going to say 250 centimeters high and maybe only 40 centimeters wide at this point. It'll probably change as we start to model it. So that looks pretty good in relationship to the character we have in place. I'm going to right click and choose Editable Spline again. And again, one of the things, the first thing you want to do is make sure that all your knots are set to be corners. So right click and set to corner again. And then we can shape this out however we like to get the kinds of angles going on it that we need. So I'm going to make the wall a little bit thinner maybe at the top and maybe a bit of an angle on it. And we can use the refine and about waist height. I want a window up here that you can kind of see through into other sections of the space station. I'm going to turn snap off, and maybe around waist height or so, there's going to be sort of a piece that sticks out down here. And so with 2 on the keyboard to get to my segment mode, I'm going to pull that piece out, and I want a piece in here for some pipe work and whatnot. And let's just go and add a couple of verts close together there and a couple of verts close together there. And then again, 2 on the keyboard to segments, and we can pull that in. It's going to create a segment that goes in. So let's see what this looks like now in the final result. So 2 on the keyboard to get out of my segment mode. I'm just going to move it over a bit more just to have it shifted over a little bit and out of my way. There we go. And we're going to go and grab the original wall path now. Press X and type in sweep to get the sweep modifier, or you can find it in the modifier list, or you can go into modifiers and you can look for your modifiers in here if you like, or you can do what I've done, and I've also added the main menu bar from the top across the top into my control right click and flatten that menu so I can easily get to modifiers and other items through my right click menus. With the sweep modifier selected, I'm going to use custom section and select pick, and then pick the wall shape that I've been creating. So you can see now, I've actually done this once already. I've got a setting change that I'm going to set back to default, and that's this one. You're going to get this sort of result to begin with. And that's because the alignment is aligning up to the pivot of the rectangle that we've generated here. So you can see it's in the middle, and it's going to align up to that middle section. Down in the pivot alignment section of the sweep modifier, we want to choose the lower right-hand corner. And what it'll do is it'll align to the bounding box of this lower vertex. So you'll actually see if I go and select that vertex in the bottom corner, you can see that it always stays aligned to that point in that bottom corner. And that's what I'm looking for. I want to know what this inside shape is going to look like. In the sweep modifier also, we want to turn on generate mapping coordinates. This is something you want to do with any procedural modifier or procedural object that is generating geometry for you. If it can create mapping coordinates to whatever degree it's doing it, it's better than having it not do it. So I always turn it on. I'm going to hit F4 just so I can see the wireframe, and you can see that we're starting to get a result for the walls and some poly counts on it. So now I can go back and do a little bit more modeling on the shape itself. So I'm going to do that in the front viewport here. Back into one, and I want to add a little piece on the top, let's say, that sticks out, sort of a piece that sticks out. Two for the segments again, maybe pull that out, and I think I want to take that vertex back. And then we want to round some pieces out. And here's one of the reasons why I keep everything corners is the fillet tool will fillet things really well when they are corners. But if they have Bezier handles, you'll find they can do some odd things and won't necessarily produce perfect contours or curves that you're looking for, because it's going to be based on the length of handles at any given point. So it's not going to produce really good results. So make sure everything's set to corner. So if I take these two bottom ones down here, and I think I'm just going to straighten this out first, because we want to make sure everything's straight to begin with. And so we only have to do the contouring at the last second. So I'm going to go to fillet, and I'm just going to round those corners out. And you can see it's rounded out our walls. I'm going to round out these two and maybe make those round. And if I take them right together and push them right up to one another, you'll notice that those two vertices have come close together. I'm going to weld those together. And if you hit weld and they don't weld, just turn up your weld amount and then weld them. And it'll reduce your poly counts. You won't end up with a bunch of segments crammed together there. So you can see now that we're getting these nice contours on our shape. So maybe up top, we want to do some of that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and fillet these and maybe fillet those together. And again, I'm just going to weld those so to reduce the poly counts up top at the same time. And we're starting to get some nice wall contours going there. So we can shape this however we like, and it's going to automatically shape the wall. And we can come back to it at any point in time. We don't have to commit to it right now. Turn off the sub-object mode, back into our path shape for our wall where our sweep modifier is. And we're going to then make some changes here. So back down to the line, back down the corner, I'm going to show end result. And I'm going to grab the corner vert here, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say fillet, and I'm going to round out that corner so it rounds out nicely. We get this nice perfect rounding happening. Same thing that's going to happen in this corner. Now, something I mentioned before is that I only made this one 20 by 20 and this one 80 by 80, and you can see why now that you get the shape that indeed it's actually an 80 by 80 on the outsides of it, and that's because of the way that we aligned up the shape spline that's creating the profile of the wall. So we're starting to get what we're looking for. However, we've got a lot of vertices. If this is going to real time, we might want to reduce it a fair bit. Even just for rendering, we might want to reduce this because it's just unnecessary, some of these extra poly counts that we have going here. So the way you do that in the path for these ones going vertically along the corner pieces, we go into the interpolation rollout, which seems to have moved itself to the bottom for me. It's usually higher up. And we can change the steps along the path, so we can reduce those. And maybe a 3 would be good for sort of real-time environments, let's say. You can also turn off optimize if you want. What optimize does is it optimizes straight lines and doesn't put any segments in them. For this we're really not going to want to do this because we don't want all these extra segments in flat areas. It doesn't make any sense. You can also see that it's probably making some areas not work correctly. And that's because it's starting to overlap on the polygons, these extra polygons. So we want that optimized on anyways. We want that to stay on. Now, if we head over to the profile shape, we can now control the ones that are horizontal in mesh exactly the same way. So we have the interpolation steps, and we can turn that down to something that makes more sense. So maybe a 1 even if we're going out to real-time environments. That's going to look pretty good. And certainly even in a film, this would probably render perfectly well if it was way off in the distance and it was a long shot or something. We don't need all those extra polygons. This is also going to be far easier to unwrap and pack. Now, half the unwrapping is done for us because of the sweep modifier, so it's going to be very handy. So from here, we can then start extracting our shapes and building out the modular pieces that we're going to need now that we know all of these fit together perfectly. So step 3 then is extracting all the modular pieces. Now I want to go back and make a little bit of a quick change as I think about what I want to do here. This centerpiece, for instance, and maybe this 80 centimeter long piece that are going to be straight pieces of wall, I'm going to want to put windows in some of these. So I'm going to create one, extract it, and then make variations of it, some with windows in them. And I want those windows to be able to go straight through. If you look on the back side, you'll notice there's no segments that have been created. That's because our spline here doesn't have any vertices down this back wall. And so I don't really have any way of putting a hole in here really easily. And I would have to then start putting swift loops across them. So one way to do it is just to do it on all of them and do it in the original profile shape to begin with. So I'm going to go and use refine and then just refine about there and refine about here. And you'll notice now I actually have those edge loops that are going around the back of the wall. Again, ensuring everything's going to snap together properly, and I have geometry that all fits together. So that's pretty good to begin with. One, to get out of my sub-object mode there. And now let's go about extracting these pieces. And then I'm going to select the walls again. And this is an interesting trick. I'm going to use an edit poly modifier. I happen to have one over in my toolbar that I've created for my custom setups. So I'm going to add the edit poly modifier. And this is something I generally tell people not to use because it's not a procedural modifier. Sticking one above a sweep means that if you make any changes to the line below or the sweep modifier, it's just going to blow up anything you do in the edit poly. But here's an interesting way of using that, sort of knowing what it's going to do. So I'm going to go into element mode and extract an element. So in this case, I have this piece here, which is the wall piece. I'm going to go over to my ribbon that I dock down the side and press detach, and we'll name those accordingly. I'm going to call it wall underscore 160 cm underscore, and the underscore is there to break off the index numbers when I start to copy them around to make the level. I'm going to press OK. And you'll notice it's no longer part of that object again now. So this object, this original wall piece, is currently called line 01. We might want to change the name of this into something useful. So we're going to call this wall path, so we can find it again easily. And once again, I'm going to go in and pick all of the elements and break them out. So I'll go and do that to each one of them, and then we'll start from there. So with all those pieces broken off, what we really have now is the original shape that we swept along has no geometry left in it. We've removed it all from that original piece. But in the idea of working non-destructively, I don't want to destroy that original shape. I want to be able to build from it and add on to it if I need, create extended pieces and different lengths of pieces, and be able to keep going back to it as a starting point to ensure that everything fits together. I could create new splines for that as well, but I like keeping things as I build things so that if I need to go backwards, I can do it really easily. So I'm going to get out of sub-object mode here and turn off the element, and I'm going to select just the top of all these pieces. And with my snap on, I'm going to snap these over here somewhere, which the corners aren't in the right places yet. And you'll see that essentially my original shape is completely gone. Let's go back and select that though. We had called that the wall path, so it is actually still here. And we have the edit poly modifier. Well, if you turn off the edit poly modifier, you'll see that it all comes back. So I'm actually just going to delete that edit poly modifier and remove it so that if I need to go back now, it's there and I can go back and continue editing just as I was before. Now, with all these new pieces, I need to do some editing on these and ensure that they're all sort of set up in a really logical format that's going to make sense. One, I'm going to select each one of them and go into rotate mode. I'm just going to set the center point here, and I'm going to rotate each one of these with angle snap on so they're all facing the front, and so they're all sort of lined up where the edge of the wall is that's going to match each other so that they make sense. They have some logical sort of organization to them. I'll just align them up roughly here, and then we'll go about fixing these up a bit more. I'm also going to change the color of these so we can identify which ones they are. So the next step you really want to do is make sure you set the pivots, and we want to set the pivots to the corner vertices in this case. These elements may not be snapped in all cases to the very corners. It looks like they are actually on the grid, but we can snap them to the vertices on the corner as well. So shift right click, grid and snap settings. I'm going to go and turn on vertex. Then press insert to get to your ability to edit your pivot and move it around. Make sure that your snap is on up above, and I'm going to go and snap the pivot of each one of these pieces then to the corner, and you'll see that the pivot's in the same place because it all originated in the same shape. So I'm going to take those pivots now and just move them into the same places. So they're all relative to each other in the right locations. Now, the other thing you want to do is, in this case, nothing's been scaled and the pivot should be all aligned the same way in local space. So if I alt right click and choose local or change it up top here, I should be able to see the local axes and they should all be aligned to each other. But something I always do is select everything, go over to the utilities panel, turn on reset Xform and reset selected and make sure that they are. Make sure that everything is aligned up correctly to each other. I'm going to right click on these and say editable poly, and now they're all reset. Because these ones have been rotated, the pivots weren't aligned correctly. So now they are. So now we have, a perfect alignment of everything, and we can assume that they're all aligned facing the front viewport. This is a great way to get started with these. From here, we can start to detail some of these and make some added extra pieces to be able to work with those. In this case, we're going to add the pipe work that goes down in the slot, or we could add other elements if we wanted to be able to go from there further. So now let's start creating some detail pieces. I'm going to start with a pipe work that's going to fit in this groove that I generated here. And here's an interesting way to work. Now, if I wanted to do that, what I could create are a couple circles here to start with. So I'll do that. I'm just going to turn my snap off, go to my front viewport, and I'm going to create a couple circles in here. It's got a layer. I did some house cleaning here and I haven't got that layer chosen. So I'm just going to do some circles in here. Maybe one like that. And I'm just going to copy it down. And these will then fit into this section here, something like that as these pipes running around, and I can pick and choose where I want them. So there, I'm going to select the top one, convert to an editable spline, and then I'm going to attach the other to it so they're both attached, or I could run them around one at a time if I wanted as well for a top and bottom, but I'm just going to attach those together. And now we want to be able to apply them to the same path that the wall is on. Now here's the problem. I'm going to have to make a copy of that path or an instance of that path. If I instance the path right now, I'm going to instance the sweep. If I make a copy and I decide to make a change to the wall or add a segment to it, I'm not going to be changing the pieces for the pipework as well at the same time. So here's an interesting trick. I'm going to go back to the original wall path. I'm going to take the sweep and I'm going to cut it off of here, not just copy it, but cut it so it removes it. So now we have the original spline. With my snap on for the grid, I'm going to make a copy of this, and I'm just going to copy it over and back here out of the way for a second, so it's offset so we can see the original. But instead of making a copy or an instance, I'm going to use a reference. And a reference is quite unique. It's quite interesting because what a reference does, it'll reference the original, but it in itself can have unique modifiers on it. So you can see when I use a reference, we get this blue bar in the modifier panel. And anything that exists above that blue bar is unique to this shape. So I'm going to right click and paste the sweep modifier back in. So if I go back now and select the original path and, for instance, make changes to it, it'll allow me to be able to work on this path. And you'll see I can make changes to it. It's a change in the original. So now I can use it again with another reference for the pipework to ensure it sits in the same place. So I'm going to turn off the sub-object mode. And I'm going to make a second reference of this right into the same location again. So a second reference. And on this second reference, I'm going to add a sweep modifier again. And this time I'm going to use custom shape again, but this time I'm going to pick the pipe work. So I get these pipes here. Now we might need to change up some of the settings for what the alignment is. So I'm going to go back to one of the original alignments, and it looks like my pivot point's in the wrong place. We want it to be there, I believe. No, it looks like it wants to be one forward. There we go. And that should be aligned up to the wall pieces. And I could use these alignment tools to try and get it to align, but you probably will find it doesn't align very well. But we also have the offsets. So if I just move it up now, with the alignment set the same to what the wall was, we can get it to sit in exactly the same place essentially. Looks like it needs to get moved in a bit as well. And so we can pull that back and in. Or again, we can change the initial alignment and work on it. But now you can see those pieces fit perfectly inside of the other ones. And any changes to this original path is going to result in the changes also to this swept pipework. Same thing too, there's way too many segments along it. The length is just fine because this path has been changed, but the segments around it are too high for game resolution. So I'm going to pull those down to something quite low. Maybe a 1 looks pretty good. And you can also go about ensuring that they're smooth if need be, and make sure that the smooth path, smooth section is on so that they're smoothed around. So you can see now we have these shapes for pipe work, and they should exist in exactly the same locations as their counterparts. Now we want to go about extracting those in exactly the same way that we extracted the wall pieces. But in this case, I'm going to extract them, and then I'm going to set pivots, and you'll see why in a second. So I've extracted all the pieces, and I now have them extracted. You can see I still have the path selected. I've changed it to be called pipe path. I'm just going to get out of sub-object mode. I'm going to leave the edit poly on top of the pipe path. But now we want to make sure that these will snap into the exact locations as their counterparts. So it's best not to move them first and try and do this because there's no corner to snap them down to. So we want to snap them into that same corner position. So again, insert, and we want to make sure that our grid and snap settings, again, are set to vertex. Again, you could probably do it to the grid here as well if you like, because they're all aligned to the grid anyways. So either will work, and we're going to make sure that snap is on with S, and we'll just go in and grab each of these elements now and snap our pivots to the corresponding location. With all those done, I'm just going to go back and make sure that my grid point snap is on and hit insert to get back out of the edit mode for the pivot. And now we can go about moving all of these out of the way and know that they're going to be able to snap into the right locations. And in our pipe path, I'm going to delete the edit poly modifier just so I can see the original again. And I'm going to have to do some rotating once again to ensure that the pieces align correctly and make sense. And again, we want to make sure that we reset X form on all of those. So I'm going to reset those and then convert them down to an editable poly. And I'll just set the color so I can see what I'm doing. I'll make them a slightly darker or brighter green so we can see those. So if I take one of these now and I snap into place with the grid snap, I can easily snap them all into the exact location that they're supposed to be, because they all fit into the corners of each of their counterparts. This is going to make it really easy for snapping the entire level together when we get down to it. Now I can also make some variations on these to make them end, or maybe make a box in it so that some of them go through some sort of transfer box or whatever. Maybe they curve down or up. So I can make edits to them now to make them a little more interesting, have variations of pipe pieces. I could even go and make those variations back here in the original, and they would be able to just be extracted again. We'd have ones that we know would fit exactly in the right places. From here, it's going to be as easy to edit some of these. I'm just going to make a copy of this one out, and this will be a copy. So we need to make sure it's a copy because we're going to edit it. And 4 on the keyboard, and we're going to grab the front polygon and the back polygon. Just right click, inset, and inset it. And then we can go back over to the ribbon and go ahead and bridge. And what we'll have is a window. So we can easily add windows to these pieces now just by bridging a couple polygons together. I've created 3 extra pieces with a little bit of variation to them, which are just windows in this case is for the 80, the 160, and the inside corner piece. Now we might want to chamfer these off and have kind of a beveled edge on certain pieces so that they get nicer highlights and whatnot. And it depends what kind of real-time environment you're going to, how many polygons you want to use here. But I'm going to do this procedurally with the chamfer modifier that's really excellent in 3ds Max. I'm going to create it on this long 160 piece with a window first, X, and type in chamfer and grab the chamfer node. Now by default, you're going to see it's doing some things we don't want. One thing it's doing is it's chamfering areas that we're not interested in chamfering off. So the other thing is it's also creating a chamfer that has too many polygons. It's kind of trying to round the corner off for us. So if we're going to real time, we're going to chamfer these things. We want them to be as simple as possible. So first off, in the mitering, I'm going to change it down to try and allow the try to just sort of knock the corners off. This way, when we piece them together, we'll look like we've got panel pieces in our space station with these, separated elements. You could also do this with normal maps and texture if you like as well. I'm going to play with the amount, just reduce it a bit. We also want to get rid of these extra ones where it's chamfering where we don't want it. And that's the minimum angle. So what's the minimum angle in faces? And as we turn that up, you can see we can remove those areas. We probably want it somewhere below 90 because we want 90s to work. But if you notice, if I go up, we're just below 90, I'm losing this bottom of the window. That's because this angle here is not 90 because of the curve in the wall. So I'm just going to bring it down a little further, and that looks pretty good. Now, what's nice about modifiers and doing it this way is I don't have to go and do it to each one of them individually. I can do that to them all at once because I could have selected everything and have done it as an instance modifier. You can also instance your modifiers really quick by dragging and dropping. If you drag and drop a modifier, it becomes a copy, so you can see that it's a unique copy. I'm just going to delete that. But if we control drag and drop, it's going to paste it on as an instance. So we can easily just run around each one of our pieces now and put it on as an instance. Now we want to run it as an instance for now as long as we possibly can. Hopefully it works on all of the pieces in the same kind of way. So some of the pieces that it may have troubles with might be the corner ones. For instance, if we've got a possibility where the angles are a little different in these, and they don't appear to be. It looks like we're getting good chamfer everywhere around, so I'll inspect those. Now, if we happen to make a change in that chamfer, we'll get updates to all of them. What's also nice is I'm going to ensure that I do my unwraps below my chamfers and then check to see if the chamfers have unwrapped correctly. I want to essentially unwrap as little as I possibly can. So hopefully that's worked pretty good. Now, all of these are going to have to get unwrapped, although we turned on the generate mapping coordinates. These will all be generated with UVs that are set to a one-to-one mapping. So if we have a look at that with the UVW unwrap, you can see that the seam is across the top here, and it's essentially unwrapped it as one piece all the way around. The other thing that it's done is that this end piece now is probably just crammed down in the corner and doesn't have any UVs at all. We may not need it. If they're put together and they're hiding them, we may not want to see it, but we might want to see it if it becomes the end of a wall of some kind and we're just seeing that end piece. So we're going to want to pack these a little better. And so we can break off the back, break off the top, break off the bottom, for instance, and take the panels and pieces we want and lay them out better. But at least we're at a starting point now where most of the unwrapping is done for us. It is completely laid flat and we don't have to worry about it. I'll let you go from there, and it's unwrapping and into texturing, and then just simply building out your level by snapping the pieces together as instances, and they will all update on the fly as you start to build it, which is great. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial.